Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, we are almost into August, the deep dog days of summer. Politics is hot, national security is hot, international affairs is hot, and we're going to keep our focus on all of those things with one of my favorite guests of all time, a returning champion, an intrepid reporter, an inspiration to veterans and many others. Rejoining us finally on Independent Americans, the great and powerful James Laporta is back. Welcome back to Independent Americans, sir.
Thanks for having me. That intro is crazy, but thank you. I appreciate it.
Yo, you've been doing some crazy coverage in the last, 5 years, especially. Right?
Yeah.
The last time I talked to you was Halloween 2019. And you brought the Baghdadi story and the dog story.
Yeah, that's right. Baghdadi had just been killed, and everybody wanted to know, what the name and the gender of the dog was that was on the raid, which was somehow even a bigger news story than Baghdadi dying somehow. Like I don't know if we talked about this at the time, but the Conan O'Brien show, when he still had a show on TBS, they reached out to me to find out if it was true that the dog was named after him. And I was like, yeah, that's a true thing. And then it was really weird because Conan O'Brien reached out to ask about that. And then there was a segment about it on Saturday Night Live. It was a crazy week.
And the dog was named after Conan O'Brien, not Conan the Barbarian.
That's right. Yeah. I tried to make that clear in the story. Yeah,
Well, you've got a lot of other interesting intersections. We share a good friend in Milo Ventimiglia, who's been on the show. You worked on This Is Us. You've been reporting at AP, Newsweek, and now The Messenger. I want to get into that. I want to get into your exclusive about Trevor Reed. I want to talk about Private King in North Korea, the FBI coming to your house, and a lot of other things. But before I get to all that, you have recently moved to Washington, D.C. So, James Laporta, where are you and how are you?
I'm good. That's true. I was living in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is sort of in the middle between Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina, and Fort Liberty, I guess it's called now, which is formerly Fort Bragg over in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And I was taking this new job here at the Messenger, and they were like, we want you to get more FaceTime at the Pentagon. So, something I just love to hear is to go walk into the Pentagon. But so I just moved to the area. So I've been trying to acclimate myself. I've been to a couple Washington National baseball games and, visiting the museums. I've been doing all the touristy things, that I haven't been able to get to do. So that's been my summer.
That's great. And we have a son that's the same age. My oldest son and your son are the same age, which makes it that much more fun going to DC and experiencing all that. I think DC with kids, especially if they like sports and they like being outside, is pretty cool, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was really excited to take him to the American History Museum. He had zero interest in it. He was like, I was like, look at how cool this is. And he could care less. The only thing he liked was that they had a C-3PO and R2-D2. That was the only thing, out of the 5 floors of American history, that was it. Everything else he was just not into.
Can't blame him. But you also took him to the Pentagon. And I think it's a good thing that you took the Pentagon to ask tough questions, especially after there's been kind of a changing of the guard. Barbara Starr has recently retired. There's kind of a generation of Pentagon reporters that are in their, the later parts of their career, and this new blood is coming in. And you've always been able to break some pretty incredible stories despite living in Florida and North Carolina and others. So I hope that this proximity will get you even more access and even more contacts. Let's talk about the story you broke in the last couple of days here. Trevor Reed, American veteran who was held in Russia for something like 600 days, released in 2022. You reported that he had been wounded by a landmine in Ukraine. Right. I full disclosure, I don't know if I knew about this before you or as you did before you wrote it. I got some outreach from some folks that were working with the family to try to get him medical care and try to see if they could get him out, which is kind of, this, there's this underground network of vets that try to help other vets in a lot of different ways. Right. I got a phone call and called a couple friends, and I kind of knew about his status. But can you share more about your reporting, what you learned, and what you think is most important about this story?
Yeah. So, I mean, Trevor Reed, for people who might not know, made kind of national headlines in the past year or so. He was sentenced to 9 years in a Russian prison colony. The charges were, BS, for lack of a better term. And through a lot of negotiation between the Biden administration and in Moscow, he was released during a prisoner exchange. Well, sometime after that, after he got out in 2022, I guess he joined the Ukrainian forces, and I guess started fighting in Ukraine. And I'm not sure when that occurred, but this past weekend, I'd gotten a tip from a source of mine that he had been injured by a landmine. He took shrapnel, which is a common injury, for Ukrainian forces who have been literally have been fighting almost like World War I style. Like, it's been trench warfare. It's been fighting wave after wave of Russian and Wagner forces. There's been tank battles, and then you added the factor of they're fighting drones. So, I mean, it's different. It's way different than the wars of, say, Iraq and Afghanistan, that most Americans have knowledge of. And so he was injured and has been trying to get home for better medical care, and so he started petitioning, the U.S. government to try to get him home. The U.S. government was kind of frustrated because from the beginning of the war that began last year, the U.S. government has kind of been adamant that they don't want Americans going over to Ukraine to fight. And so, but they were particularly kind of frustrated with Reed because, they worked to get him out of a Russian prison. And now he's gotten himself injured in Ukraine, where they've said, hey, we don't want Americans fighting. So that's kind of, but I guess, he started to work with an NGO, and I guess he's on his way back to the United States. So that's kind of the gist of the news. Yeah.
Yeah. And you pulled apart, a really important policy component of this, right? And this was the debate, offline and in the network, which was like, can we get him to someplace like Landstuhl? Will they take, or will they not take him on a military base because of the precedent it would set, right? And that was the question here. It's like the U.S. government didn't seem to want to say, if you're an American veteran, they have been saying you're on your own, right? Don't expect us to come get you. Don't expect us to be able to use medical facilities if you get hurt over there. But it sounds like they did, right? Like, I mean, it sounds like there was some governmental support and maybe ongoing now to get him at least medical care. Do you have any more information about that?
Yeah, there seems to be some level of coordination between the State Department and this NGO. And I'm not sure of what the NGO is, but to get him at least moved out of Ukraine. Apparently, he was in a hospital in Kyiv. I don't think it's gone to the extent of the State Department sending a request for assistance over to the Department of Defense to ask for a medical evacuation. I don't think that's occurred, but there does seem to be some level. But you're right, the State Department doesn't want to publicly set a precedent of if you're an American veteran who served honorably in the U.S. forces, then we're going to help you out, if you get injured in Ukraine. There's been many Americans who served honorably in the U.S. armed forces who have gone over and gotten injured. And, if you do it for one, you got to do it for all. And I think the U.S. government's trying to stay away from that, particularly at a time when, U.S. assistance to Ukraine is criticized every day, and there's this open question of well, how much can we give the Ukrainians? And at what point, is enough? And so that's a constant battle that the Biden administration has to fight just on a day-to-day basis. So then you add in something like this, it's kind of a distraction for the U.S. government.
Yeah.
In terms of what the totality of government's mission is in regards to Ukraine fighting back Russian aggression.
Yeah, I mean, right before we went on air, I'm getting attacked right now by Glenn Greenwald and other radicals for a number of things, to include having a Ukrainian flag of support on my Twitter page, which I've been unapologetic about. I proudly support Ukraine. I'm wearing the St. Javelin shirt right now. I am all in on supporting Ukraine. And I hope, frankly, Trevor Reed will come on this show and talk to me, because I think I could relate. I mean, again, his experience is not something any of us could understand fully, but if the Russians held me for 600 days and I got out and I was a Marine, I'd want to go back and fight back too. So, I mean, to some extent, this maybe it should have been expected, right? And you can't stop him from doing it. But I also think it cuts to that larger issue that you have covered to some extent. I know you're tied into that. There are many Americans that have fought over there. And this is kind of an untold part of this story. And there are Americans going every day, and there are Americans who feel that pull because they feel like it's the good fight. And we've had many folks on this show. But do you have any other insights to the extent to which there are Americans over there and how the Pentagon is dealing with that, maybe behind closed doors?
I think they're trying to. I mean, behind closed doors, it's like I just said. It's like they're aware of it. They're not gonna. I mean, the most they're gonna come out and say is like, we don't want you to go do it, but they're also not gonna take any measures to say prevent it. You know. Yeah. And I think that's because the U.S. government understands that Ukraine is in a fight for its sovereignty. They're in the fight of their life, you know. But no, I think you hit on what Mr. Reed's mindset is that, you know, he's a guy who, you know, was in a Russian prison, you know, and Marines have a certain mentality. And I think that's exactly why he went over to fight. It was kind of this idea of like, I'm going to get my revenge, you know. That was actually expressed to me through my sources of like, that's why he was there. And I think that's understandable. You know, the larger question of should he have gone or not, that's for people to debate. But I think everyone can understand that mindset of why he went.
Can I push you? Last time you were on, you were great in showing us what it was like to report on these issues, especially under the Trump administration when reporters were being criticized and targeted. But I did notice in your reporting that one of your sources, at least, was an unnamed DOD official. This didn't seem to come from the family. It didn't seem to come from Reed. It seems like it was leaked from someone in the Pentagon. Is that correct? And do you have any idea about why?
Well, I won't say of where it was leaked from. But yeah, these were U.S. military officials. We did update the story with a quote from a Biden official, you know, basically saying that our reporting was correct. I mean, I do know that there was some efforts of, you know, can the DOD get involved in helping him out with evacuation, right? Particularly, you know, like, you know, him being a Marine, and, you know, but there really isn't a role for the Department of Defense. They're just, you know, because he is a veteran, he's not an active duty service member, you know, and to be clear, and, you know, and the Biden administration has made this clear, he wasn't there fighting on behalf of the U.S. You know, he went over there on his own accord. But, you know, for the Department of Defense, it really just isn't a role for the Department of Defense, just because given his status as he's not a, you know, there is the saying of, well, once a Marine, always a Marine, but he isn't a Marine anymore in the eyes of the Pentagon. Right. So there just wasn't a role, you know.
Right.
But that's not to say that the Pentagon and the larger Department of Defense wasn't contacted about helping, you know, Trevor Reed out. Mm-hmm. You know, but there wasn't anything for them to do.
Yeah, the bat signal went up. I mean, it went up low key, right? And we saw this a lot in Afghanistan, right? This was the digital Dunkirk, trying to work to get people out to try to help. So I think a lot of that kind of infrastructure of help and that network is active in a lot of ways now, right? Beyond Afghanistan, a lot of it has transferred over into Ukraine. A lot of it is around when we know a fellow veteran is suicidal, right? Or we haven't been able to find, right? There's this network that you're a part of and you report on. But let me ask you about another story you've covered, because your contacts have been great, which was crazy in a different way. This guy, Private King, makes a run for the border in North Korea. You did some pretty extensive reporting on this. What do you think folks need to know about this, and maybe what's unique about your reporting on the subject specifically?
I think there was enough. So last week, I got some exclusive documents out of the Army that kind of detailed excuse me, the events that led up to him actually crossing over to North Korea, and then his past legal troubles while he was on his rotation in South Korea. I think there was enough there for his unit to have like they could have saw this coming, I think. So one of the documents that I found was a year before, like he ever crossed into North Korea. He went AWOL from he was supposed to be at a formation, like a morning formation for accountability, and he didn't show up. And they called him, and he's like, "I'm not returning to post, and I'm not returning to America." And that was a year before he ever crossed into North Korea. And then from there, he, is involved in an alleged assault. And then there's a second assault. So he assaults 2 more people in a second incident. And not only does he do that, he damages a South Korean law enforcement vehicle. And he was ordered to, the South Koreans, under the status of forces agreement between the United States and South Korea does have jurisdiction to prosecute service members. And so South Korea was like, well, you're going to pay a fine. And he says, no, I'm going to take this to trial. So South Korea combined the first assault and the second assault into one case. And he ended up paying, payments to the victims in those assaults. He was found guilty of damaging South Korean property, and they ordered him to pay, $3,500 in US dollars. A private, in the Army doesn't make $3,500. They just don't see that kind of money. And so he was like, I'm going to just go to jail. So he spends 50 days in a South Korean labor camp. And basically at that point, he was deemed an embarrassment to the United States. You can imagine that, getting in trouble in South Korea as a U.S. service member is way different than getting in trouble, say, at a base in North Carolina. Like right. You're not only representing the Army, you're representing the United States as a whole. And so just given the hostilities from North Korea, it's not a place that type of behavior is just not tolerated, So he was basically deemed an embarrassment to the United States, and they were going to send him back to Fort Bliss, probably for administrative separation from the Army. And so he's escorted to the airport, and for whatever reason, the escorts were not allowed to go through security. And he gets to his gate and texts the escorts, "Hey, I'm at my gate." And they just kind of trusted this guy. And instead he leaves and he books himself a tour. And this is the kind of the craziest part to me is, so he books a tour to tour the demarcation line between North and South Korea, what's called the Joint Security Area. So he books a tour through a private company. That private company submits a manifest of everybody that's going to go on that tour. They submit the manifest to United Nations Command. And one would think, well, this guy is an embarrassment and he's getting kicked out of the country. His name would be flagged on the manifest. It wasn't. United Nations Command was like, yep, everybody's good. And he used his name and he used his government ID, by the way, to book the tour. So the United Nations Command was like, yep, everybody's good. So he goes on the tour, which started at like 2:30 on, I think it was July 18th. And an hour later, he runs, into North Korea. And he runs between South Korean and US military members. They chase him. He runs behind a North Korean building, jumps into a van, which is suspect. Like, I don't know, was that van there just as a coincidence? Or was this pre-planned? Like, did North Korea have some sort of prior knowledge? And that's actually something Army counterintelligence is looking into. And he's driven out of the area. I mean, it's a crazy story, but in terms of the why, we don't really know right now.
And where is he now? And has anyone been held accountable? I was asked on TV the other day, how could this happen? You explained how this happened, but where is he now? And is anybody going to be held accountable for letting this guy fly away?
I mean, he could be partying with Kim Jong-un right now, and like, who knows where he is?
We don't know, right?
Yeah. And, how could this happen? There isn't like a gate at the Joint Security Agency. Like, you can just run across, but but there's this like invisible barrier there. It's kind of like if you're on a cruise ship and you decide to just jump into the ocean, like people don't do that because you're jumping into the ocean. Well, kind of the same thing is applied. There's not a gate there because it's generally accepted that it's a bad idea to run into North Korea. So that's why people usually don't do it. People are usually running out of North Korea, trying to get to South Korea.
Yep.
Not many people are trying to get into it. So, how does this happen? Very easily. Like, I mean, in terms of planning, if his plan was to get to North Korea, which it seems like it was, flawless.
Right.
Like his plan worked perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, this is like this is, you have worked in Hollywood. There is somebody, I'm sure, writing a script about this right now, except we don't know how this, wacky, weird, upside down version of a Jason Bourne scene, how it ends. We don't know how it ends. He could pop up
right.
He could end up dead. He could end up in Leavenworth. Like, I'm sure you'll be among the first people to report that, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us about it. Let me ask you about a couple other quick things that are national security related and adjacent. We've covered it a lot on the show. I've commented a lot publicly. Tommy Tuberville and his holds on the military. It was recently reported now that something like a dozen flag grades have had to extend their retirement, basically cancel their retirement to stay on. We know it's been extremely disruptive. Now we're getting into the school year. Well, it would be more disruptive. There was new reporting this week that Tuberville's lied about his father's World War II service. It's like every week there's a new Tuberville thing. But I want to ask you, because of your proximity and your relationships with the Pentagon, can you, James, share any insight into what this is actually like for the Pentagon, and what are they doing about it? Like, if Tommy Tuberville doesn't resign as a senator, he keeps this hold on there. Are there any loopholes? Are there any end arounds? Is there anything the SecDef can do to minimize this disruption, which could, conceivably go on for the whole year?
Right. I mean, to me, it's comparable to like when the Defense Department has to go on a CR, a continuing resolution, when Congress fails to pass the budget. I mean, the Defense Department is, the military is beholden to its civilian leaders. Like, it's in civilian control. And so the Defense Department is kind of like between a rock and a hard place, I mean, we don't have a commandant of the Marine Corps for the first time in over 100 years, which is crazy. Like, and you can see that symbolically. So if you walk into the Pentagon, there's an area of the Pentagon that is, the Joint Staff area. And you see the row of pictures, and you see who is the general in charge of each branch of service. When you look at the Marine Corps, it's black.
It's just an empty picture. There's no picture.
There's no picture. So there's a picture for every other service, including up to, General Milley and Secretary Austin, but there is no picture for the Commandant. So symbolically, it's just not great. And, Senator Tuberville has made this argument of like, well, they can do these jobs in an acting role. What he's not saying there is not only do they have to do it, conduct the role in an acting role, they still have to maintain their current position. So they're dual-hatted. So, for the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Smith, who was nominated, he was the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps. So now he is the acting Commandant and still the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps. And that backs up all the way down the line. The military runs on chain of commands. And that starts from the general down to the private. And so if it's affecting the generals, it's going to roll down to the colonels. It's going to roll down to the lieutenant colonels. It's going to roll down. And so it's not just a bunch of admirals and generals. It affects every branch within the chain of command. And the other people who get affected by this are the families. Why, spouses, not just wives, but spouses, husbands, and wives are trying to plan, typically in the military families move typically around 3 years, 3 to 4 years, and they're usually moving from one base to another. Well, that takes a significant amount of planning. You think about just, moving from one state to another. Well, many military families move multiple times over a long career. It's hard to plan, what school my kid's going to go to. It's hard to plan where we're going to live when I don't know, when there isn't, predictability within those movements. Right. And right now there isn't predictability in those movements because of his hold over the military.
And so, and this seems to be like a political front that the the more extreme right wing of the Republican Party, which is increasingly more of the Republican Party, wants to engage in. Like Ron DeSantis has announced that a priority of his presidential campaign will be to rip the woke out of the military. And what they're talking about is Tuberville's attacks on any leave for abortion-related travel, anything related to birth control, women's reproductive rights. They're talking about trans people openly serving. They're talking about even things like diversity initiatives, right?
Right.
We've talked about with Amy McGrath and others. But can you talk, James, about what it's like go beneath the surface for the functioning military, right? Now, we've had these culture wars in America, but the military has always been kind of off limits. Now you have the military in the middle of everything. Can you talk about the impact you see that having on people in the building? Is it impacting morale? Is it impacting the conversations in the building? Is it as disruptive as when we've had the CR and we've had wars overseas? Now they're dealing with a political war back home. Can you take us inside the Pentagon and what this culture war is going to have, what the impact it's going to have on the building?
Yeah. So ebbs and flows in policy, right, affect morale, right? And that's kind of the issue that the military is supposed to be apolitical. It's they are civil servants. People who serve congressional people, they serve the public. I know congressional staffers who will serve a Republican and then will turn and then serve a Democrat, because really it's all about just serving the American people. Right. They really don't really care about if you're a Republican or Democrat or independent. They're serving. And that's what the military is based on. It's an apolitical building, and the people who serve in it, they'll serve a Republican president, they'll serve a Democrat president, but really it's about serving the American people. That's it. Where morale gets impacted is if I come in and I'm a service member, and there's a policy states that I can go get uncovered reproductive health care, and then the next day I come in and, well, actually, no, you can't. That affects morale, that unpredictability in policy. And that's what's going on right now and by the way, the other thing too, that Senator Tuberville doesn't bring up is, so one, the military is not paying for abortions. That's just blatantly untrue. Two is they're paying for travel, and yes, that if a service member wants to get an abortion, they're paying for that travel. Well, the one thing they're also not talking about is it's not just for abortions. It's for things like IVF. And I know this from personal experience, is a couple that's going through infertility and facing infertility issues. It is a depressing time. It's not fun, especially when you're trying to have children and you can't. I mean, the impact of that on a woman is, it's really devastating. It's really just not a fun time. And the military does not cover IVF treatments. And those run pretty high. Like $20,000 or more to do IVF treatments. And so the military is also paying for that travel because it's not covered healthcare under the military's healthcare system. So the military, at the very least, is paying for those couples to travel to get IVF treatments. And what the military is trying to do is standardize care, because when Roe v. Wade, when Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, right, it created a disparagement within healthcare. So for a service member in California, you have access to uncovered healthcare, including abortions. But if you're a service member in Texas, you might not have that. So what the policy does is all it does is just standardize the healthcare so that a service member in California has the exact same access as a service member in Texas. That's the only thing the policy does, was trying to have a standard of care in terms of healthcare, because the Supreme Court created a disparity.
Yeah, which cuts to your point about predictability and morale, because in the military right now you feel like the earth is moving underneath you, and I think I made this point before. 20% of the military is female. 20% of the female recruits come from two states, New York and California. And if you're trying to recruit talent, which is what the military is trying to do, and you're trying to recruit female talent from New York and California, you're saying to those people, you might end up in Texas, you might end up in Saudi Arabia, right? You might end up somewhere where you don't have
Right.
the rights. And by the way, you also don't have access to IVF where you probably do in some private companies at Google and places like that. So they're competing for talent in a really tough market when recruiting is down. So I don't think that's been pulled out enough. How, you know, the young people of this country and parents are watching and saying, hey, I can't blame you, you know, Susie or Johnny, if you don't want to give up your rights and go get stationed in Alabama under Tommy Tuberville's reign, or like I've said before, in other countries where we're subjected to the rules like we talked about in South Korea and in the Middle East and in other places. I want to stay on this with you in the weeks and months to come, because I think it's often misunderstood and kind of manipulated, especially by politicians. Let me ask you, as we kind of wrap up here, James, you mentioned when we were getting ready to start that you had a knock at your door from the FBI. You've been some pretty hard-hitting reporting. It's hard to report on these issues for a number of different reasons. You're now at a new place called The Messenger, which is, in my view, lucky to have you. And you're continuing to focus on national security and military affairs. Tell us about your FBI story.
Yeah. So, you know, it's amazing when I first, so I got out of the Marines in 2014, and I really thought coming into journalism, I would mainly be covering like war and conflict and things like that. But it's amazing how many things I didn't anticipate covering, like sexual assault, sexual harassment, but also extremism within the ranks. It's a topic I never thought I'd be covering, that there would be service members who join the military, not because they want to serve their country, but because they're trying to, you know, ramp up the lethality of their neo-Nazi group that they're privately a part of. Like, that's something I never thought I would cover. And I've covered it more frequently over the past couple of years. So recently, probably in the last month or so, I went public with a threat that came my way. So I reported, when I was at Newsweek, I reported on a Marine. His name was Liam Collins. Liam Collins was an infantry Marine at Camp Lejeune. You know, on paper, stellar Marine, you know, but he was privately a neo-Nazi. And he was trying to, and it wasn't just him, it was a group of people, which I didn't know that he was a part of a group of people who were also service members. So I reported on him being, you know, an active duty Marine, but also being a part of a neo-Nazi group. About a year later, in 2020, I was in South Florida, and my then wife came in and said, the FBI's outside and they want to talk to you. And I thought she was joking, you know, because I was like, okay, you know, and she's like, no, I'm serious. And this was like 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. So it was really, you know, it was dark outside. So it was also, it kind of spooked her. She was sitting in the car finishing a phone call, and she gets a knock on the window saying, hey, we're the FBI. I thought I was going to jail, you know, just because, like, you know, when you deal in national security, you learn things that you're not supposed to learn. And I thought it was like I was going to jail for like a source or something like that, where they wanted to know my source. I was gonna be like, I'm not telling you who my source is, and therefore I'm going to jail. I thought it was like something like that. And I had just gotten hired at the Associated Press. So I was like, oh, this is not going to go over well. But I walked outside, and, you know, they asked me, do I know a Liam Collins? And I had since forgotten about the story, you know, and I was like, no. And they're like, did you write about a Marine who was, you know, part of a neo-Nazi group? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, well, there's been a credible threat made on your life. You were added to like a kill list. And I was like, well, what do you mean? They're like, well, we found a photograph of you. It was a picture of a guy being executed during the Holocaust, and they superimposed your face over the guy's face who was being executed during the Holocaust. And apparently I was on a list of a whole bunch of people that they had grievances with. And this group that he was a part of what they said was they wanted to create a modern day SS unit, you know, to assassinate, you know, key members, particularly members of Black Lives Matter, journalists that they had grievances with. I think Governor Whitmore's name was on there. They were gathering gear. They were training in the woods. They were, training on marksmanship. And it was really scary. I mean, the Marine in me was like, come on, bring it on. But I also had a wife and, I think my son was 3 at the time, something like that, 3 or 4. And I was kind of scared for them, because I've been in combat, so I'm used to violence, but they're not, so they were really freaked out about this whole thing. And this was the second time that I'd been threatened by service members who were also neo-Nazis. The first time was I reported on a Marine who was a part of this group called Patriot Front. And they sent a business card to my house as a kind of a subtle, like, we know where you live kind of thing. So, historically, the Defense Department has downplayed extremism in the ranks. Historically, they've said, well, look, if you look at the totality of our ranks, extremism is a small problem. That's true. However, it does not take a lot of people to create a lot of damage.
Yep.
And so I've always kind of felt that argument was disingenuous because, yeah, sure, the totality of U.S. service members are not neo-Nazis. However, the ones that are can be very dangerous, and you have to have a mechanism to address that. Other than kind of retroactively addressing it, like, oh well, okay, we'll just kick them out of our ranks. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't really address the issue. Just by kicking people out of the military, that doesn't solve the issue at all.
Yep. I think this is one of the most underreported stories in America right now. National security story, political story, social story. I'm catching hell for it right now because I said that we should, look at our laws to figure out if they need updating to react to this threat. And some critics have conflated that with my call for fascism or spying on all Americans. I'm saying no. I say, look, we are listening in on ISIS and Al Qaeda, and if the Patriot Front and Oath Keepers are trying to infiltrate the military so they can weaponize their members and kill people, we should be tracking on that. That is a legitimate national security threat, and we don't have to wait for an actual act because the threats are much more prolific than people talk about. And I think we've heard about some of the threats on politicians. There are a lot of people in the media who've been threatened who haven't talked about it. And
sure.
And I appreciate your candor and your courage in even talking about it. It's terrifying, but it's also real. And I think our country has to do a better job of not just protecting elected leaders, but anybody who could potentially be on a target list, which is a growing number of people right now. And not just, it could be teachers, it could be voting workers. So I think it's a time for an open discussion about this, and also a real discussion about how significant and serious the threat is. And your reporting and your experience has done that, man. And I'm really grateful for it. I think I hear your son in the background who might be ready.
He's playing Minecraft.
I want to give you the time to get back to him and to get back to your reporting. You've generously offered to stick around for a couple questions for our Patriot members. I'll ask you a Star Wars question and some summer questions that are fun. Thank you to our Patreon members for making this and all episodes possible. But James, thank you to you, man, for your courage, for your tenacity. I think what you're doing is patriotic and a tremendous public service, and you continue to break stories, man. And I said this last time you were on, is because people trust you and they respect your work. And I think you're doing a great service to everyone. And I'm grateful for all your leadership, and I hope you'll come back again soon.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's very kind of you to say.
The Messenger is lucky to have you. Follow James everywhere. Look out for him in the museum, and definitely follow his reporting. Thank you, my friend. Stay vigilant.
Thank you.